in my personal view, we're living in the 1910s, basically, where there are like other pockets and points of view from the world, whether we call it from USA or Russia or China or India or even Middle East. I mean, if you say all the countries together. And one of the biggest issues of this kind of situation that we're facing right now is miscalculation. And in my view, my humble view, the issues we're facing, the biggest issue right now worldwide, because of everything else, the Russia-Ukraine war post-COVID, and that has come about. I do think one thing that doesn't get stated enough, that the Russia-Ukraine war happened in February, and for 2 years before that, there were no meetings of world powers in any forums or bilateral or any other thing. So a lot of cues were missed, a lot of miscalculations were done, in my view, on maybe all sides or both sides or many sides basically as well, for which we are now coming to this point. Similar things happened also in 1913, 1914, but nobody thought that this could be happening, but a series of miscalculation and intransigence led to a catastrophe of 4 years basically, and the world was never sitting afterwards. So right now we must make sure that our communications are better, understandings are better, seeing the other person's point of view is better, and we do avoid catastrophe as much as possible through better understanding of...
I think it's valuable to remember that it was felt also in Russia at a time when Russia was becoming open-minded, parts of it were liberal, and certainly many Russians embrace an optimistic future instead of the kind of bleak nihilism that we've seen. The one exception in terms of large states is China, of course, and the conclusions of the collapse of the Soviet Union in China have really formed the basis of nearly everything the Communist Party has done since. The lesson of the collapse of the Soviet Union, so far as the Communist Party of China is concerned, is not to repeat it in China. And so I think we can understand Chinese authoritarian from that perspective. Of course, the past year has been an extraordinarily traumatic one for one big reason, and that's Putin's naked aggression on Russia's western neighbour. We had thought that that kind of aggression, the attempt to annihilate a state's existence, was a thing of the past, just as we thought that using nuclear threats was a thing of the past. And it turned out not to be the case. The consequences of the war, of course, are several, but they speak to the title of today's discussion in the sense that they have knock-on effects and they remind us that things are interconnected. The first thing I think that happened is that, much to the West's surprise, a lot of Western countries came together and realized that, along with Ukrainians, these things are worth fighting for, that independence, sovereignty, autonomy are valuable things and not things to be lightly thrown away. Of course, not everybody, not all parts of the world were convinced, but still 143, 145, I forget the exact number of countries, condemned Russia's aggression. 6 pretty despicable countries approved of it. The second sort of consequence, though, was that it had an energy and a commodity impact almost immediately in terms of higher fuel prices, which were immediately felt around the world. And then the third consequence from that is that it's affected the economy. So now the world is looking at a global recession. Whenever economists predict a global recession, they're usually wrong. But I'm not an economist, so I'll predict that actually large parts of the world will be in recession in this coming year.
Before I go back to Winston and Nabil, could you talk a little bit about, you had mentioned as part of your points, did you see evidence of a small turning of the tide? Could you elaborate on that point a little and give us a few data points?
Yes, Zafar, you mentioned the rise of authoritarians, and that has been troubling, and we've seen how in the States the rise of Trump has led to political turmoil that's playing out day by day this week in Congress as the Republican Party fails to choose a speaker. But authoritarians were or have been in vogue around the world, from Bolsonaro to Brazil, to Modi in India, of course, Rodrigo Duterte, the president, the outgoing president of the Philippines, Xi Jinping himself, president and general secretary of China. But authoritarians, at the end of the day, and I should also include my country, Great Britain, where a would-be authoritarian, Boris Johnson, has, I think, sort of proven the point I'd like to make, which is that authoritarians, or wannabe authoritarians, have to perform. They actually have to deliver the goods. And it turns out that populists and authoritarians are not very good at doing that. And to me, the huge example, again, is in China, Xi Jinping, who has had a personality cult built around him, and therefore who is seen as responsible for everything good that happens in China, has overseen some things that have been very, very bad. His approach to attacking tech firms in China has been to destroy wealth and opportunity. His economic policies have included failing to come to grips with a devastating property crisis, and his COVID policies have locked down hundreds of millions of people with no discernible point. If the state had a point in terms of its policies and extending those policies and trying to keep Chinese from actually seeing how the rest of the world was opening up, well then that point was undermined by the sudden about turn a month ago in China, which has as a consequence certainly allowing Chinese to get back to normal, but it comes, or it certainly is coming, if the data was actually published, it's coming at a huge human price to the vulnerable in China.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Winston, I see you taking notes, so I imagine you have something to say in response.
We face in the world today can be attributed to any single country or group of countries. We live in what we call an interdependent world. And what we do in the US will elicit some reactions from China. And what China does will invite reactions from Britain and the European Union, etc. I condemn Putin for having moved into Ukraine. But I will say that the news that we've been getting fails to indicate that at the time of the reunification of Germany, a promise was made to the Russians, but actually to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had not yet dissolved, that in exchange for the reunification of Germany, NATO would not move its troops further east than the easternmost border of East Germany. The Bush administration, the first Bush, observed that punctiliously. The Clinton administration, however, came to power and decided that we won the Cold War. There should be no limits on what the winner ought to enjoy. So we have to think of what happened. Russia lost in World War II, approximately 70 million people died. The Russians lost about 29 million of those. And much of it came from the West. To say that the Russians would not be sensitive to what happens in their western border would be
naive.
Well, a bit naive, perhaps something else. But that has to be taken into consideration. And to the idea that Ukraine might move into NATO created a certain level of anxiety. Now, I don't think it justified the invasion of the Ukraine, there are mechanisms under the UN Charter that could have resolved some of these issues. The second point has to do with the model of the Chinese Communist Party after the dissolution of Russia, the Soviet Union. The Chinese did learn. They were not against the experiment that the Soviet Union was going through. After all, they had adopted a system that included capitalism as part of their own development by then. But what they said to the Russians, to Gorbachev, in your reform, see to it that the economic reforms take place before the political reform. Otherwise, you're going to lose control. That's the Chinese model. They're saying, if you go first with the political reforms, you're going to be losing control. And remember, you have a single party controlling the country, as it were. So those were two. The third response I make is this. It is not simply that the current system has failed us, or we have failed to employ the common security system we created. It is that two competing systems have emerged. We have a US-centered Western security system with all of the US allies. We have the possibility of a Chinese system emerging. And the common security that is going to give all of us the security we need is being allowed to die slowly. Yeah.